This traffic noise is just really annoying. I drew a little diagram. So the 528 Hertz is actually always available to us. But when we have a thought, it's the ego at 741, and it's a faster frequency, and it interrupts this. So really it's like an ego thought and just a tiny little bit of the background, the space in between thoughts that we don't actually notice because it's always talking. So that would actually almost be like the equivalent of a breath in. We can't really talk while we're taking a breath in. You could almost imagine that when your ego voice is talking in your head, that it needs to take a breath in between sentences. And that breath is like a pause, and that pause can actually be a lot longer. And when we start to notice the space, and perhaps identify with the space, if you want to say identify, then that is the silence from which sound comes from. And when there's enough space, it's the 528 Hertz, and then that's when the 528 Hertz can actually hit our heart and our eyes, because when we're not thinking, we're not actually creating images on our mind screen. So when that silence becomes more pronounced, we actually can see. And then when we can actually see with our eyes and our heart simultaneously, we're going to have different impressions that are more like insights, not thought, memory, voice, sound, image complexes. And the silence, there's no dopamine in silence. So thinking is tied to dopamine. I wonder if I feel like I get some kind of reward from seeing new insights. I wonder if that's dopamine, or I don't think it could be, because it's not from the prefrontal cortex. I think it's something else, because learning this way is actually, in my mind, real learning. Just learning by observing, not thinking and looking for answers and thinking other people are the ones that are going to tell me the answers. Because if I have a clear mind and a clear heart, the universe will tell me the answers. Answers that I wasn't even asking for. Because our brains are designed to learn in this way, but they've been hijacked. And when the mind is silent, we can hear what's really there talking to us. It's a different language. It's a language of silence. And I think we have to have a silent mind in order to be able to recognize that language. Because the language of noise impedes that. Because with this, if all of a sudden the ego's thoughts are largely gone, and there's just a little ego thought here, a little ego thought here, and the rest is 528 Hertz silence, that's going to allow a perception insight to arise as a holistic impression that we then can unfold with language as we speak. The whole sentence comes to us, and it's not a sentence that is from the past ego. And so we just speak the sentence. We don't even pre-form sentences. That is from the associative process in the prefrontal cortex. We don't need to be associating about reality in order to experience reality, because the associations we're making about reality are usually old. I think dopamine is our voice. It's tied to our voice. And oxytocin and something else is tied to giving voice to the insights perceived by clear perception of the universe. And that's giving voice to that And giving voice to that is something completely different. It would almost be like if I was able to look at a tree and almost tell the tree's story from the tree's perspective, because it can't speak for itself. That would seem a little bit strange. But the trees might actually tell us something. They might tell us, man, you human beings, you're freaking doomed. We trees will be coming back. Our seeds are everywhere. I feel like part of this death feeling, when one is losing grip of the ego, when the ego is losing grip of us, that is our voice losing grip of us, and that's tied to dopamine. I feel like it's almost dopamine withdrawal that makes us feel that terrified. And if we're that terrified of dopamine withdrawal, that's going to prevent the other circuits that are trying to come online from being fired up. So fear takes over, and when fear is there, it blocks the love that is also there. It almost makes us want the ego back. And I wonder if a lot of cortisol is released when the dopamine circuit is shriveling up. There's like a stress that happens. I think cortisol is tied to dopamine, because if we're not reaching our goals, which is a dopamine thing, we feel stressed. So we're stressing ourselves out because of our own voice and what it's telling us that we should be doing. So our own voice produces the cortisol and the dopamine, but the more stress we have from the voice, the more cortisol comes in, and that's what attacks the hippocampus. And then we can't sort out things, and there's that lack of X Forex sensation. So old voice elements from our past can come up and play on our mind screen and increase being terrified, and that's when sort of there's too much allostatic load and lack of X Forex sensation. So too much allostatic load maybe is what causes us to not be able to feel that it's coming from the past. But it's all coming from the past is the thing. So it seems like dopamine and cortisol keep us tied to the past. No wonder society's based on problem, reaction, solution. Create a problem, reaction, present the solution, then people feel better, but we feel stressed all the time. So stress is really not good. If we're stressed, we're going to naturally want more pleasure in order to get rid of the stress. So by creating a chronically stressed society, we're going to be chronically going for dopamine things, which is actually going to totally mess up our brains. So society's messing up our brains in this way for us to seek individual pleasure to get away from this chronic stress, and we're not working to get rid of this chronic stress in society. We're too busy reacting to the chronic stress. Whereas if we were to get rid of the chronic stress, we would be able to naturally more easily bond to each other and support each other, and we wouldn't be living in such fear for our own personal gain. The universe is trying to save us from dopamine. It's trying to save us from our own voice. And I don't think cognition is cognition. I think it's recognition, it's recognition. It's from old memories, past associations, and thoughts. And it has nothing to do with now. And it has nothing to do with now. I think it's actually tied into re-emoting. So it's re-emotion too, because these images and thoughts usually have an emotional component, which is like the mirror of the thought image in the brain. It's mirrored in the neuropeptides that are in the body, and then we remain addicted to those thoughts and feelings because they're familiar, just like our own voice is familiar. I think this recognition and re-emoting process actually keeps us consistent. This is actually what we take to be ourselves. This is who we think we are. We're just a dopamine emotion thought image past memory complex. I think children on the autism spectrum don't have these dopamine circuits. It's almost like when it's time for that to fire up at the age of 2-ish or something, they don't fire up. And it could be the universe preventing that. They can't be as easily turned into Pavlov's dog. And the kids become deaf to the noise of reality. And when you think about it, there's way too much information, there's way too much noise, there's way too much flashing lights, there's way too much everything. So if you think about the collective humanity as one organism, then it makes sense that a certain number of brains are going to get downregulated from having these dopamine circuits, because there's way too much information and stimulation that's based on dopamine circuits. So a certain number of brains are going to get downregulated to not respond to that. And Dr. Bruce Lipton says perception is what has to do with epigenetics. If these children can't perceive that information, they're not actually going to be responding to it. So in a way, it's sort of like erasing that information from the collective social fabric, because certain people aren't actually perceiving it and responding to it in their reality tunnel. It's creating a different reality tunnel. And the reality tunnel that's being created is one that's not so set on dopamine and the prefrontal cortex. And even people who haven't been diagnosed with anything are trying to reduce their prefrontal cortex. They're doing yoga, they're jumping out of airplanes, they're surfing big waves, anything to get their own voice to shut up. And I think humanity is one organism, and we have to think of it that way, and to consider social phenomena and physical phenomena as a manifestation of the collective. I remember reading or hearing that when birds are in the air, they're actually one organism. And when they land on the ground, they're separate little things taking care of their own physical needs, walking around on the ground, eating their bugs and their worms and stuff. And they still pay attention to each other, they're aware of each other, but they're still doing their own thing. But if they take off all at the same time and all just fly where they want to go, they're going to run into each other. And I feel like this 528 Hertz consciousness of nature is part of us too, and there's a collective that we're a part of, a collective consciousness of humanity, and it's to do with the relational mind, the mind beyond the brain, and the mind beyond the brain that's trying to create what it is through us and through our brains. And it's going to do that no matter what, if we're trying to or not. That's what's going to happen. And one of the ways is to reduce the noise of the prefrontal cortex. Well, the universe is already doing that for us with the next generation. Unfortunately, when we pathologize them, we don't understand them. We don't realize they need different environment, no noise, different way of learning. They'll learn faster along a lot of lines, but slower with language, because language is the problem. Them hearing their own voice in their own head is the problem. MAP consciousness activates other circuits in the brain. And it doesn't mean a person would never use the dopamine circuit. It just means that they wouldn't be used by the dopamine circuit. And the thing with all these new circuits being activated is we don't know how to act. We don't know how to use them. We have an awareness of the former reality tunnel, and it's a small band, but now we have this huge reality tunnel and this degrees of freedom we never had access to before. It's like being set free. But being free within a prison is quite difficult. In a way, one has to be a bit of a frequency holder and just hold the frequency of 528 and still operate in the other frequency of 741. And that's related to what I was talking about before with trans consciousness. It would be residing and abiding in 528 and still being aware of 741. And then the mind and heart become a receiver of 528 hertz, and it's not just playing its own tune on repeat. It's receiving so much other information from the universe. We are a part of Gaia and human collective consciousness. We are in a chemical prison of our own endogenous biomolecules. Based on what we perceive images of fear or pleasure, and that is the duality that we move between. If we have a clear mind screen and clear heart, we see in the moment and we create those biomolecules of the moment, and it's always new and it's always a different combination and it's always interesting. And in manic consciousness, the universe imprints on us that vision, and we always have that imprint. So it fires up those circuits, and even if they go offline because of the structure of society, we still have that imprint, we still have that pattern. And so it's basically lying kind of dormant, and that's why I talk about embodying one's mania and moving towards that, and that would eventually maybe invite the circuits to turn back on. And it's not a matter of do this step, this step, this step. It's about actually doing things differently all the time in a way, because if we're practicing the same thing in the same way, we're just creating another habit and reward circuit. And I was also thinking about how Len Horowitz said that the sun is 528 hertz. Well, when we sit in the sun, we're absorbing that 528 hertz on our skin, and that's probably what is involved in activating vitamin D. And vitamin D turns on, I think it was like 30,000 genes or 3,000 genes or something like that, which have positive effects. So the sunlight is actually an epigenetic thing. It activates the vitamin D, which turns on certain genes. So that's epigenetic control of genes. So if we're not getting any sun exposure, we're not getting enough vitamin D. And one of the biggest things that happens when a person doesn't have enough vitamin D is cancer. So in a way, it's almost like if we're not out there kind of worshiping the sun in a way, like being outside, being connected to nature and getting sunlight, we're going to get cancer and die. And so nature has so many ways of killing us off, embedded in its own systems. And it's only going to get worse, because I think soon supplements are going to be like illegal, or only pharmaceutical drugs, and then we have to get a prescription, and then we have to pay more, and then it's only in a very, very, very small dose. It's not going to do anything anyway. So we're really going to be in trouble. So we have the wrong values. So MAP consciousness is trying to create a new kind of relational human being, and it's a type of human being that is not valued in this dopamine culture. People with dopamine brains see people that have gone through this sort of transformation and are perhaps struggling, because it could be like a second infancy where it takes a couple years for the brain to sort of learn how to be in this world and that other perception of things. And a dopamine brain looks at us and thinks, well, that person doesn't give me any pleasure and they cause pain, so I'm just going to stay away from them, not value them, and drug them. So it's kind of scary. That's why we need to create lots of context and lots of dialogue with each other to talk ourselves out of what we've been told. MAP is actually like acquired different learning and thinking styles. Trans consciousness. I also read somewhere that pure support is about critical learning and renaming of experiences. So I'm doing that with myself. I'm doing peer support with myself. I feel like mania is sensory deprivation from the ego and society. The ego is society. It's what we need to function in society. We've become functions of dopamine. The ego is a sound, light, memory complex, and it's images that we've recorded, and it sounds in our own voice, and it's the past. And then we can't properly perceive the sounds and lights that are coming to us from the external world. And when we receive those impressions, we can actually understand, and a different way of knowing happens.